Hello and welcome to another BetaKit Live. I am Douglas Saltis, editor-in-chief of BetaKit, and this is the first professional haircut I have had in 2 years. In our last BetaKit Live on the subject, cybersecurity experts noted that the pipeline to develop a diverse set of cybersecurity talent in Canada was a little congested. I highly recommend you check that out. A person interested in cybersecurity generally must first complete an engineering or computer science degree, then apply to take additional courses related to cybersecurity. And given that most are often content to stop there and take a lucrative job offer as a developer or working engineer, it's happened to create this significant cybersecurity talent gap with over 3.5 million cybersecurity jobs that need to be filled by the end of this year. That's a lot. It's October, folks. But that disconnect between developer and security talent extends from academia to the workplace, with misaligned incentives between those teams leading to a blame game of finger pointing on who is ultimately responsible for a company's security. As a non-technical marketing expert and many of those tech companies, I can completely agree. I have seen this happen. It is very exciting, and there was always popcorn at hand. With major recent cybersecurity breaches like SolarWinds and, just 2 weeks ago, the Twitch hack, the stakes have never been higher. So we need to solve this problem. Joining me today are a bunch of experts here to help heal this divide, and I'm super excited to introduce them right now. First up, we have John O'Brien, the security lead for customer success at Microsoft Canada. We've got Dave Burnison, a technical advocate at GitHub. And then Kara Wolf, CEO at AmmoliteAnalytx. So before I start asking them hard-hitting and serious questions about how we solve these deep-seated problems within Canadian tech companies, and maybe have them spill a little bit of the tea of their personal experiences, I want to make sure that you are involved in this conversation. You are probably watching this on our Twitter live stream, possibly our Facebook live stream, or perhaps VOD. Don't worry if you are. What I want you to do is make sure you're asking questions to our panelists that we can answer either live during the session or afterwards when we host the full VOD on BetaKit with a little write-up, and make sure your voice is heard and the experts answer your questions. So if you have questions, post them in now. They'll be sent to me. We'll handle them during the sesh. If you're seeing this sometime in the near future, perhaps in November, and you're like, oh man, I missed this great thing. I have this question I want to ask. Don't worry. Pop it right in the comments section and we'll include that in the roundup. Okay, so let's begin. Let's get started. I was talking before about the tension, the blame game, the finger pointing. Worst case scenario at Canadian tech companies, operations can often appear as a Clint Eastwood style standoff between engineering, security, and management. I'm hoping maybe we can unpack the perspectives of all the representatives here before we ask them to put down their 6-shooters, because I feel like the only way out of the blame game, the finger pointing, and the silos that I've seen at tech companies, large and small, is a little bit of empathy. Let's get the human side going here. So, John, you're in the interesting position of kind of representing both, I guess, the security component and the developer component. You've shown up to this live stream in a hoodie, so you are obviously on brand for this conversation. I'm wondering, can you talk us through a bit of this divide? Maybe let's start from the developer perspective. Why are devs who just want to ship code on the daily, they want to close those story points, so upset about security stomping all over their beautiful work?
No, that's a great question, and it's a topic that I'm very happy to go into. I think one of the things that we tend to forget is that the developers are people. They're people just like all of us, and they have incentives and they have needs and wants. And at the end of the day, like they have pressures, right? And the pressures are typically to get stuff done as quickly as possible and get it shipped, right? And like that's not something that they necessarily want to do. That's something that they're being told to do. And when they kind of run into the brick wall that is typically security, that creates friction. Right? And I would suggest very unhealthy friction. We always hear that, the developers are just, slinging stuff into production. They launch it over the fence to the ops team, that they don't care about what they do. Right. And like most of the developers that I know, they care very much about this. They want to deliver, products that are good, that are secure, that actually work for their users. But when they don't have time, the thing that drops are all those extraneous things. And the thing that goes out is the basic functionality of the app. If it's secure, that's someone else's problem, right? And if we blame them for doing what we've told them to do, but I don't see how we ever really step back and fix the problem or even understand the problem.
Okay, so if you tell your engineers to move fast and break things, you might find your major social network no longer live on the internet for like 12 hours. That makes sense. There's a consideration there, but there was something that you had mentioned, I think, related to this before when we were kind of getting together and scoping out what we wanted to talk about today. And it's not even the initial command to kind of like ship quickly, but maybe the expectation of solving the problems after the fact and just that we'll just patch it later mentality. Is that aligned to what you're speaking to? Is that an additional burden of pressure on devs to get things out quickly and then fix after the fact? Or is that just what they tell themselves to sleep at night?
No, I think like there's some huge market pressures involved in kind of getting products out and out the door, and you know, in some cases, companies will invest a lot of money into security and doing things right. And like, Microsoft is one of those where we very strongly talk about, security by design and building that in from the beginning. Not all companies have that luxury, right? And I think when we shift the blame from the business as a whole down to the humans who are kind of building the code, I think that's slightly unfair, right? So I think a lot of it's just understanding where those decisions are actually being made, and then making sure that we understand, whether or not the developers have the capacity, the capability to actually do what they're asking them to do, right? If me as a security person comes in and says, like, I want you to deliver a secure system, have I articulated what that actually means? Have I given them the tools to help them do that effectively? Or am I just saying, like, do something really complex that I don't actually know how to tell you what to do, and don't fail at that? I think that's kind of the world that we live in right now.
Okay, that's an excellent way to get both Kara and David in this. I'm going to start with Kara because, I think, and this is something that we've explored in past BetaKit lives on the cybersecurity subject because it's so important right now, and it provides just this wonderful lens inside the operations of the companies that BetaKit kind of covers and writes about every day. But Kara, there's something you said off the top that just the idea, following up on what John is saying here, that like developers and engineers are not trained on the principles of security. They are not given the tool sets to do this. If they have received any sort of like academic training to for their career in the profession, and it's not just like a boot camp scenario, that often does not include any sort of like security compliance standards or anything, right? So they're coming into these organizations maybe dark as towards their expectations. Can you unpack that a little bit and maybe just talk a little bit about some of the work that you do?
Well, sure, I'd love to. So what we've seen in industry is the young grads coming out, they have the basic fundamentals in computer science. They can write basic code. They can do it, fairly quickly for juniors, but they are juniors, and they do need mentorship and sponsorship, and they do need to be raised and grown like any other industry professional. And they are not being taught security by design as a foundational part of their post-secondary learnings. So we see them trying to get security by design and security operations courses and classes and certifications as they struggle through and go through the climbing of their careers. So when employers are looking at hiring juniors, they tend not to want them as much as they want an intermediate or a senior, because they're going to have to hire two people to do the job of one person. So we really do need to include security by design in any and all training, and as well as professional development as we bring the young devs up. So professional development is an ongoing thing, and not everybody is both a dev and a security expert like John is. Usually you'll get one or the other, and there's always trade-offs between the cost to develop, the cost to bring commercialized product to market, and you have to balance that against what the customer is willing to pay. So because of the change and the nature and increase in rate of sophistication in the types of attacks that we're having, basically between 26 and 40% of leaked and stolen records were software related. So that's quite a bit, because the software is insecure. So we see that in small shops, we see that in large shops. So, Microsoft is not exempt, neither is Apple or Cisco or small shops as well. So this has got to be something that is looked at from the entire supply chain. And
Mm.
anywhere the bad actors or the threat actors can get in, they will. And so they're looking at insecure software. That's a really large gateway to get in. Um, so the training is critical, and then the mentorship and sponsorship and ongoing training is critical to our workforce. And unfortunately, Canada is way behind the rest of the country. So, we need a lot of improvement in this area and in this space.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you're almost talking about, we were talking a little bit before about just kind of like ship it and fix it later, but it's really difficult to patch like design gaps after the fact, or when it comes to kind of your workforce, their knowledge gaps. It's not something. This isn't like a just don't do that scenario. It's being able to kind of scope out fulsomely what threat vectors might be, what open holes might be in your code, and kind of understand that from the beginning. I think that's a really fair point, but I think, and let's go to Dave here. On the other side, there is this tension here between what it takes to be thoughtful in your approach to design thinking and then impact on speed. And I know, Dave, like obviously you're at GitHub now, you've had tons of experience like within the Microsoft ecosystem, but you also worked at some small companies that were acquired. And I think you're pointing like the difficulty for a developer and engineer to maybe spin up a database instance to test something at a smaller company versus a larger company. I think for maybe people who are showing up to this because of some of the company names involved here who aren't developers, I think that's a really accessible example for people to understand the balancing act that we're talking about here. So could you just share some of that, please?
Yeah. So this goes back. I've been Microsoft and GitHub going on 6 years now, but this goes back to when I was working for a small ISV like 15, 20 years ago. And we were a small, nimble team, worked very closely together, and that, the DBAs were just down the hall, and we could say, hey, I got something I want to test out. Can you spin up a database for me? And, in a couple hours or so, they'd have it spun up. But then when that little company was successful, we got acquired by a very big company, and then things changed, and it would be, oh, you can't just go down the hall and ask this person. You have to submit this form and wait for approval, and then get that database created later. And that couple of hours went to a couple of weeks, kind of a thing. So it really slowed down just how nimble we could be with all the checks and things that were in place to make sure, and a lot of that did include the security aspects of things.
So is that a human consideration when we're talking about the scales of organizations where you're just like, I no longer know the person that I could go to do this? Is it more, or is the gap there, the breadth of maybe process considerations related to like getting approval to do that thing versus, showing up in the right meeting room with the right box of pizza to get what you want internally done?
Yeah, it's really, I'd say it's both, cultural and process. I know one of the things after joining Microsoft that I came away with, and this is now at GitHub too, it's like everybody's focused on delivering value to our end users. That's the ultimate goal, and that's how our incentives and everything are based. So you don't really have that conflict between, okay, developers, they're incentivized by how many lines of code are they writing or how many story points are they completing, whereas operations might be they're trying to slow things down because they want to keep things stable. They don't want all of these releases that are risking breaking things and all that. Everybody's focused on, are we adding more users to our service? When we add users, are we retaining them? So everybody's focused on those customer goals. Then you get things, and then you get people working towards those same incentives. And then also with that now, like with the cloud and, leveraging infrastructure as code and dev test environments and things like that, make it so much easier to spin up those test environments and things. And yeah, when you're using infrastructure as code, you can pick up and use a script that's already has the database and the application insights and various things already plugged into it, so you can be off and running pretty quickly.
Okay. You introduced kind of like a new element there when you're talking about the incentive alignment. And I know when we were all talking as a group previously, I had really had this as like a head-to-head battle between kind of like devs or engineers and security based upon things that I had either initiated or witnessed firsthand. Some tech companies, large and small. But I think, Kara, one of the things that you had kind of thrown in here was the idea, and I think it speaks to what Dave was just saying, is that there's a management component here. Like these aren't necessarily incentives that are dictated and defined by these teams. Like the leader sets the pace a little bit. And I would say for most management teams, looking to push out software updates, it's in service to the user, but there's a little bit of an element of like time is money, people, and you need to ship that product to make that money. Is that how much is the leadership component to enable these teams? Maybe it isn't good and the bad and the ugly kind of standoff. Maybe the pressure is coming from the top a little bit. Can you speak to that?
Sure. The pressure is definitely coming from the top, but it's also consumer driven, right? So when you're making things, you want the customer to be paying for them. I mean, ultimately we're all here to make money and we're all here to make profit. So if the customer is not willing to pay, then corners get cut because it costs money to hire expensive devs. That's just the nature of it. It costs a lot of money to build great product. So the consumer has a responsibility, but leadership has more of a responsibility. So they have to set the tone and say security is important. Security by design, it comes first. And they have to do professional development. They have to pay for training and upskilling and uptraining. So there's responsibility on leadership and management to put it as a priority and put their people first and not be so much on driving down costs and doing, master slave labor. Because throwing a bunch of people at a problem, we all know, doesn't necessarily fix that problem. You have to put the right people at the right time, pay them the right money, and things happen fast. So the customers have to be willing to know that they're going to pay more. And that's just the nature of it. They're going to have to pay more. So the cost of crime keeps increasing. The cost of ransomware is increasing. Well, someone's got to pay for that. Cyber insurance premiums are increasing. Someone's got to pay for that. So, we're all going to take the hit. So it's not just one person or one silo. It's a responsibility of the entire ecosystem to understand the nature of the threats that are against us, and then how we all respond as a civilization and as an entire ecosystem.
Well, and I think you're perfectly articulating there, cost from the outcomes. Like if this time and attention isn't put in on when the the horses are out of the barn, so to speak. But there's a financial commitment to making sure that there's like staffing and resources internally to actually make that happen. And maybe this is a great place to get John in here because, again, John is both of these people, so he can speak to himself a little bit. And that distinction between, when push comes to shove, the engineering team and the development team is kind of like leading and following these initiatives. And then the security team is usually a much smaller team with maybe their hoodies aren't as nice, maybe they're not getting pizza as often, limited power to kind of say no and to block products and to do that investigation. How much of that is due to just the significant delta between kind of the sizes of those teams? And I think just pointing to a company like Shopify and their commitments to the number of engineers that they're looking to hire in 2022. You don't often hear about tech companies making commitments to say, we're committed to hiring a one-to-one parity in like security experts or things like that, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, honestly. And I'll speak to Microsoft in that sense, and that we're investing $1 billion in security every year, and we have about 3,700 dedicated security professionals, right? So like that's a lot, right? We're taking this seriously, and I would argue that Shopify is equally taking that seriously. I have a lot of really good friends that work in their privacy engineering shop over there. And I think to me, it comes from it's less about a numbers thing, it's more of a cultural thing from an organizational perspective, right? If you only have one security person or no security people, then everyone else has to figure it out, right? And we have to get out of this mindset where security people are the only ones that can think about risk, right? Like that is a misnomer. Like that can't happen, and when that happens, bad things kind of end up. I think one of the things that I was most effective doing in my last organization is kind of just convincing the developers that it was actually their problem, that I wasn't going to save them at the end of the day, and I forced them to think through through that risk and start doing those basic threat modeling exercises, which everyone does in their daily lives, right? I go to across a busy street, like, maybe I'll wait for this, red car to go past because it's typically faster, and I'll run across to the next one, right? So I think that when you get people thinking that basic mindset, then it's helpful. But kind of coming back to one of Kara's points earlier about the cost to delivery and the costs that are becoming more transparent and more apparent. Ransomware is a perfect example of this, right? This is external incentives made real. We can now, as opposed to how security professionals in the past would have a hard time quantifying the risk of doing an action or not doing an action, right? Ransomware, it's like they've done that for us, right? It costs a lot of money. If you don't do basic level security within your organization, you're going to be spending some money either on cyber insurance, either on recovery, or either on paying a ransomware. And I think now that people are seeing that, like, I hope that they're going to start to wake up a little bit and realize that, like, the bar has risen from the attacking perspective. Perhaps, our bar from a security perspective, from like a, internal customer's perspective, hasn't risen as quickly. And I think like it's a time where it doesn't necessarily mean we need to throw more money or more humans at the problem. We just need to sit back and like, okay, the game has changed. What are we going to do to change with it?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, because I think to what Kara said before, and Kara, correct me if I'm wrong here, but this isn't just even a situation of like increased cost in payouts or insurance. I think you had said something interesting before where like this might impact an organization's capacity to be insured if you have not demonstrated that you are taking these security measures seriously. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're seeing more and more third-party audits being necessitated and proving that they've taken measures to keep their organization safe. And in certain circumstances, if you're denied, like you don't automatically just get cybersecurity because you apply. You have to pass a certain amount of requirements in order to be underwritten. And once you're denied, it could take up to 60 days before you could even reapply. So it's not a given that you just get cybersecurity insurance. You have to meet a certain criteria. And then if you do get hacked and you do get held for ransom, it's not a given that you're going to get your claim paid out. Because if you haven't taken the necessary steps to protect your organization, then the insurance company just turns you down and says, sorry about your luck, recovery's on your own, pay the ransom or not, but you're on your own, we're not paying it. And you're seeing more and more insurance companies taking a larger stand, especially with the proliferation of ransomware attacks. And and because organizations aren't spending enough on protecting their individual organizations. So that security budget has to go up. There's no other choice. As the crime continues, the budget goes up. And people just have to get used to paying more money for it.
Okay. That's interesting because you're saying something very similar to John there, where in terms of, I always see it as you don't want to learn the lesson after you take the test. Some of that is convincing people to look before they cross the road. John, I want to give you just the final word on this segment and just, we'll throw to Dave here. Give us the final word, just because you've been in a variety of different types of organizations coming for this. You have a lot of experience. I'm just wondering if there's an element that we haven't touched upon here as it relates to tensions within organizations that's worthwhile to bring to the fore before we all, spoilers in the back end of this BetaKit Live, solve every company's problem. Is there anything else that you feel we've kind of unaddressed here?
Well, I think one thing that's worth bringing up here is, and this applies both Microsoft and GitHub. At Microsoft, we have our Center of Excellence for software development. We refer to as One Engineering System. And this was actually, somewhat driven by Satya Nadella, our CEO. He came up through the development ranks and everything. But, so it serves as the Center of Excellence to drive the guidelines for all of software development, but it drives the requirements for, security development and everything, making sure that every product has security built in and everything. So having that Center of Excellence, they're not dictating how all teams do things, but they're trying to provide the best practices and only, make requirements where we absolutely need them for security and compliance reasons, kind of a thing. So that helps all development teams at Microsoft. And then at GitHub, this is coming down from the top too. Our chief security officer, Mike Hanley, whenever he's in an all-company meeting or any meeting, he's reminding everybody that everybody's on the security team at GitHub.
Mm-hmm.
We can never let our guard down because, yeah, we may be building secure software, but we also have to be careful about phishing attempts and things like that. Getting these emails that say, because we've even had people try to spoof some internal things, and so we have to be on our guard all the time, kind of a thing. So yeah, just keeping security at the forefront of everybody's mind, really, and that coming down from the top, from leadership and all that makes a big difference.
Yeah, Kara noted before the risks and the percentage of hacks or attacks that are coming from software, but the human element runs through all of this. So I love that you kind of tied together that idea of process change at Microsoft coming from Satya Nadella's journey through kind of like the silo of development to CEO, and then looking to stitch together a process that better works. I think we're going to dig a little bit more into kind of 1ES and what that means. But again, it points to that idea of leadership being a component in this. So, well, let's just do it. Let's solve this problem. Let's bridge this divide. We talked a little bit about empathy. We've talked a little bit about leadership. I think there was a bunch of things that I think you had all noted here that come into the fore when it's talking about turning, John had said it so interestingly, like making other people on the team know that this is also their problem, but not in a negative way, but in a way that kind of draws people together. But ensuring here that we have, and I'll just read through the list that you guys kind of given me. So it's got to be devs and engineers, security and management. We've talked about empathy, education, leadership, and communication. And I want to maybe even just, David just spoken about from the top setting that course of responsibility where at GitHub, everyone's a member of the security team. That is a cultural thing from day one. And I think those types of messages only resonate when the leadership at a company are articulating them and then hopefully enacting them and supporting them, right? But John, you had said something interesting before about this, I guess the alternative to that, or maybe looking at organizations that haven't created that culture and it's a little bit more fear-driven. So can you kind of connect what Dave was saying to, the need for there being a no fear culture within these organizations? And I'm wondering if that's related to either identifying that there's a problem and saying like, hey, we screwed up, there's something here. But then also maybe having a lack of fear in pushing back with these other stakeholders when necessary to say, you don't realize how bad this is. We can't ship this without these considerations in place. Is it both, or what's the weighting on that for you?
No, I 100%. I think like there's a bit of kind of craft to, I think, each of these industries or each of these kind of fields that that I've tried to make sure that the folks, like, if I go to them and say like, look, why are you not doing something simple as like, a code review, right? Like, in some companies don't do that, right? And they're like, oh, well, our management won't let us. Like I don't have any sympathy for that, right? Like, you need to say, like, in order for me to do my job correctly, these are the bare minimum things that I need to do, right? So I think there's a bit of that, like of the ownership, of pride and ownership of your craft. But then I think to your point about fault, right, and risk, blame, is that for the longest time when something goes wrong, right, and you can see this on Twitter all the time, right? Like, which intern's going to get fired today for taking down the internet, right? The other flip side of that is this culture of hug ops, right, which is like, look, stuff's going to break, right? People are going to get hacked. We have to assume breach. We have to assume things will go down. We plan accordingly, right? And we don't learn.
Congratulations, you brought down your first system. We've all done it. Here's how. The first time I ever made a mistake within an organization and then had the leadership be like, well, that's your one. Here's how it happened for me, made me feel so much more part of the team. And I wasn't responsible for bringing down major platforms or services that like a third of the internet uses. So that, I think that's huge. Can you talk a little bit more about like how you go from fear to hug ops, which is, I think, way better than DevOps as a term?
I love it personally. No, so I mean, I think like the simplest thing is to just look up on the search engine for blameless postmortems and just like dig into that reliability engineering culture and understand what's actually happening there and why those things have proven to be better, right? Like this isn't new, right? Like the airline industry, the healthcare industry, like they've been doing this for years, right? Imagine if a plane went down and we're like, let's just fire the pilot or fire the guy who changed the tires, right? Like, no. We actually want to know why it happened so we can learn from it and prevent it from happening again. That's not prevalent in most organizations.
Yeah.
And I think until you get to that point where, like you said, like, a new person can come in and they can take production down, and like people are like, oh, cool, pat them on the back. They're like, let's not do that again. Let's talk through what systemic factors within our process allowed that to happen. Right? It's never the human fault. If human factors is the reason on your kind of post-incident review, then like you haven't looked hard enough. So for me, it comes down to what are you doing to make that a much safer experience, right? One of the things that I like to do is to just run simulations. So you give people the opportunity to go through that pain, to kind of internalize it, and to come out of the other side. If the only way you're internalizing that pain is by taking production down or breaking the internet, like that's a not so great way to learn, right? So I think I always try to advocate for doing things that provide that safe environment. That's how you get better at
Dave,
these things.
I see you really want to jump in here. You're almost like jumping through the screen to like high five John and what he's saying. So can you follow up?
No,
and maybe even again addressing how your organization handles that.
Yeah, I was gonna notes on the side here, and I'm like, I want to, John, thank you for bringing up the blameless postmortems, and that goes way beyond just the security aspects of things. We realize we're all human. We're going to make mistakes. So we can't just be when mistakes happen, we can't just be looking for, okay, whose head's going to roll, or who's going to get demoted or whatever. And that comes into play for security issues, performance issues. Hey, we just missed the ball on the design. Whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But looking at things through a blameless postmortem, not to say who broke it, but okay, what went wrong? Was it an anomaly, or do we have a systematic problem here? Do we just need to make a quick configuration change? If the quick configuration change works for now, what's the root cause? Let's put work on the backlog to address the root cause and everything. And it also gets down to, development's a team sport. So we have to keep working as a team, and it's not just one individual that's going to make us or break us, kind of a thing. It's how we work as a team, and I see that a lot at the culture at Microsoft and GitHub, kind of a thing. So,
okay. So, Kara, John and Dave have been talking about kind of the internal process here, and just the idea that like there are maybe organizations in Canada or in North America that are not doing code reviews scare me, and I am a word person. I'm a liberal arts major, and that horrifies me. But you had brought up something interesting, I think, even before, and I want to dig in even deeper here. That sometimes, the mistakes can come because the team's a little too heads down or a little too close to the problem. So, talk to us a little bit about like third-party security audits, getting an outsider's perspective, just having someone who's responsible for going around and like pressing every button, jiggling every handle, and seeing what happens, because we do this at BetaKit, even with a small team. Every new person who joins, part of their onboarding process is to take nothing for granted. If they see something, say something, and not assume that because they're joining, that is the way it was intended. It either might be something on fire that we haven't gotten to yet, or was our best effort in a very brief window of time. So talk to us about like how, I guess, external resources can be maybe a pressure release valve on teams that are really close to the metal in terms of timeline and budgets, and provide a fresh set of eyes to make sure that best practices and standards, or just like the commas in the right place to make sure the whole thing doesn't go down.
I think it's critically important to have third party come in and take a look at your organization, and people do it all the time. Good companies do it all the time. Some of the more poorly run companies see it as a threat and might not want to open up so that everything can be exposed. But a good third party service provider will give you an honest opinion and help make you better. So it's not there to tear you down; it's there to build you up. And some of the things that you've taken for granted, you've done it the way you've done it, and it's worked so far. So, don't fix what ain't broke is the old saying. However, you can do things better. So third-party people will have different experiences. They'll come across multiple organizations. They'll have different areas of specialty. So you always want to engage those people and include them as part of your team and not see them as a threat. And
Yep.
especially when you have young professionals that are still trying to figure out their course and their direction, they need mentorship, they need leadership, and a third party can provide that in a safe environment. So a young dev could say, I thought this, I was afraid to say anything because I didn't want to get fired, I didn't want to get in trouble. So it's kind of a safe outlet and a safe communication channel. And then the third party can be a buffer and say, well, you might be perceived by your employees this way or that way, and maybe you want to shift your communication, or maybe you want to pay special attention here. So it's a safe outlet for both leadership and on the front lines, so that clear communication can be established and problems can be solved much more quickly.
Yeah. You can't have hug ops internally and then treat support resources externally as outsiders. That's not, those policies don't jive. And I would even just say, again, as someone who is, a technical lightweight on this conversation, I think that extends to other divisions of these organizations, where it comes to marketing, communications, or sales, maybe leadership teams that are directly involved with speaking to customers on how they're using the product that the developers are building. As someone who has been at, an engineering-led company that had not one but two chief operating officers, I have personally experienced the disdain that can come when it's a closed net, and there's a bunch of other members kind of like on the broader team that have a valuable perspective, are willing to contribute, and maybe their voice isn't being heard, or they don't have that process. So I think that's awesome. What we're really talking about here is like really good operational policy and procedure for kind of modern organizations to succeed. And this is probably the time that we kind of teased it before, and Dave was speaking to it. I think probably having Dave and John tag team this as they feel necessary. Like, we should probably talk about like One ES, the Microsoft One Engineering System, and what that means, because I think it's really useful for us to make sure that we're identifying for our audience what kind of objectives are achievable through this, what you measure against. I think we've all been in kind of those like, well, how many story points is this types of conversations, really breaking this down into like fundamentally, okay, what does this mean week to week for my team? How do we communicate this? How does it work? And just dig into that, because I think it'll open up kind of the back end of this conversation and what allows other things in. So I don't know, Dave, I know we had talked about this extensively previously. Do you want to just kind of, for the audience, give a breakdown of how this center of excellence, how these processes came about, and what they allow organizations like GitHub and Microsoft to kind of plug into, so that whether it is cybersecurity or accessibility or other considerations are kind of being met of front facing and foot forward?
Yeah, so One ES really kind of came about back in 2014, led by Satya Nadella, and he realized, hey, we've got some brilliant people here at Microsoft. I want to take these brilliant people and put them in a center of excellence so we can build out the standards and practices and things that we need, and then disseminate that, to all groups, because then everybody can leverage, the work of the best and brightest and everything. But yeah, now it even starts with objectives. You're right. We don't really measure how many story points are we completing and things like that. It's focused on our users. Are we growing our user base in the service? Are we retaining the customers that we have? Because if we're doing that, then we know we're taking care of features and performance and security and even accessibility and things like that. So it starts out those objectives kind of come down even then to start out at the product level, And if you look at something like what everybody knows Office, right, as a suite, and you've got Excel, Word, PowerPoint, and that. So there'll be objectives at the Office level, and then it filters down to the individual product levels, and then even filters down to the individual team levels. So if you're working on new features on, let's say, Office 365, that's in line with whatever the overall objectives are for Office for the quarter. And it might be, growing the user base of Microsoft Teams in general, and how can we plug in and help that or whatever. But yeah, these days it's about security and accessibility and performance and everything. So getting teams aligned, and then the individual teams. Another thing that changed along this with this is we got out of the silos of dev and product management and quality and security. Now we have feature teams. So you're not just a API guy within Office. No, you're on the Excel team, and you're working with another set of developers, and across all of those developers, you have those capabilities for the security experts and the API experts and the data experts, and you're collaborating all the time. So you're learning from each other and sharing with each other and all that. So
yeah, that's a huge change. I want to stick on that because it's to be fully transparent, something I've never experienced before. And I have the scars to show it. But that transition that we're talking about, like, we set up this whole conversation scenario as a group of individuals pointing the fingers at each other as external people who are kind of responsible. And it's very easy to see when you kind of have that production line approach, whereby, you hand off the horse to the next person down the line, and suddenly, eventually it turns into a camel. You're talking about building teams where, security focused design, design fundamentally, engineering teams, security, accessibility are core components and equal stakeholders on the team. So you no longer have to, as John was putting it, convince this other person that it's their problem. They're right there in the planning sessions with you, working on it. John, do I have that right? Am I articulating development correctly, John?
No, that's perfectly correct. And I think, again, when you leave security to the end, it ends badly. When you leave accessibility to the end, it ends badly. And it doesn't need to be that way, right? Going back to your point about this is just good operations. It is. It's good operations. It's good reliability. It's good security. It's good accessibility. These things just happen naturally when you put all the people in the same room and have a conversation about, are we all willing to be adults and talk to each other and point out when we don't understand something, or ask a question when the thing that they've been told you doesn't make any sense, right? And when you can have those open and honest conversations, then you start to see the gaps in everyone's knowledge, right? And there's always this assumption that it's the developers who don't know what they're doing, right? I argue very often that it's the security people who don't know how technology works anymore, because the complexity has changed so much, right? And I'm not trying to cast aspersions on either side. Sometimes the business people don't know what they're talking about either, right? So we all for the most part, are struggling, and that's we have to accept that, right? The world has become a much more complex place. And one of the things that I always talk about is making security boring, right? Making technology boring. If you can deploy your service onto a toaster, that's the correct decision. Use the thing that is old, it's tried and tested and true, and then focus on the thing that actually matters to your business.
Yeah. No, it's so important, because we're literally in a process where this month we've seen two major tech companies fail at the basic configuration to keep their internet services on the internet. And then one major, I'll call shots at my own people here. One major tech media publication company just yesterday, who had been writing several stories about Facebook or Slack's inability to properly configure their DNS, had the exact same thing happen to their own websites. So yeah, mistakes have been made, and it's, I think, very difficult to solve those with finality, given the increasing complexity. But I want to push back and follow up on what something that kind of David said, and get your focus here, because it's not just enough to have the conversation. That has to be aligned to calendars and workbacks and goals. And I'll ask this question right after I remind our audience that if you are looking to ask these very smart people some questions to get it in now, because we are at the 10-minute warning. And again, if you want to make sure that we can answer these questions, if you're watching this in the VOD so that it's in the write-up after the fact, now would be an excellent time. But I want to push back on something because more for clarity, because Dave was speaking about, it's not about story points anymore. The objectives have slightly changed, but then how do you break that down into constituent parts to make it happen? Because I've seen Jira used as both a carrot and a stick, and as just a way to completely kill team morale. And I know that there are different cultures of engineers and teams where, like, man, if they're just crushing, they'll never take anything above one story point, but they'll work through 8 of those in a day. And then you'll have the people that are looking to solve big problems. They're looking to ship more, and then there's other people that are looking to squash more bugs. How do you corral this new team with all the different stakeholders so that they're working together in that way? And what does the planning look like? Because I'm sure that there's some people watching this right now being like, this all sounds amazing, but you work at Microsoft or you work at GitHub, and I am on a 10-person team where fear is the culture, and we can't get through. Our biweekly planning meeting always runs 2 hours long, and the founders are in there adding new features while we're trying to solve last meeting's issues. Give them some management tools and structure to help them so they feel a little bit more empowered in this process to take it on. Like, how would you just blow up that meeting and say, this is the way that we're doing it, we're keeping it clean? There's a lot of pressure, but I believe in you to do it.
So I've had the pleasure of working with some amazing product managers while I was at the Canadian Digital Service, and I think that the first off is you kick the founders out of the room, right? If people can't focus, then they don't get to come to the meeting, right? The team it's the team's job to deliver. The meetings are for the team; they're not for others. So I think something simple as that is like shelter yourselves from the people that are being unhelpful. But then at the same time, like those feature stories, right? Security has to be a feature on the team's backlog. It has to be in the tools that they use, and it has to be articulated in a way that they can do something about it, right? Typically speaking, if you have a story on there and it's just, if anyone has to think about it, they're like, nah, I'll leave that for later, right? Leave it for later. It's just, I can't do something on it right now. So I think the more actionable the guidance from security professionals or from the accessibility team can be in terms of how to actually achieve the outcomes that we're looking for. Developers like to solve problems, right? They like to have things green. So if you can give them a very clear things like, right now you're red on this thing, these are the 3 steps you need to do to fix it. They'll do it, right? Because then it makes it green. They don't even care what they did. They've done it green. I think the piece of like, how do you do that with a small team is like, you don't try to figure this out from first principles, right? There's amazing tools. GitHub has their advanced security offering. There's tons of tools out there that either paid or open source. Leverage them. Right? If you're rebuilding things that are not core to your business, you're doing it wrong. I'm just going to come out there and say that. Once you kind of hit the point where like you've exhausted all of what the available tooling can offer to help you, okay, cool. Then you can start going to that level of depth. But that's quite far along the path. And if you've gotten there, then you're doing great.
Okay, and that's awesome. And for people wondering maybe what John's referring to, I think David supplied us with a couple of crucial links that we're going to drop in, at the very least, the Facebook Live version of this in the chat, and then we'll make sure it's in the wrap up on BetaKit so you can check out those resources. I want to throw back to Kara here because I think we have a bit of the insider perspective. I think you represent not quite the outsider perspective, but a bridge to different kind of like considerations here. And there was one thing in our prep call that you said that really stuck with me, and specifically around the leadership to make sure that this is really enabled and empowered internally. And just that idea of, I think you said sometimes leaders are smoking hopium when they are not necessarily, I think I got that right. When they are maybe speaking to the importance of these things, but not in necessarily empowering people like John and Dave to enact these things top to bottom. And I just want to maybe give you, we're going to go ISO Kara here and give you kind of the opportunity to like final closing thoughts on, if not the process that John just articulated, the day by day, the going from red to green, what it means for an organization and for the leadership, the founders who have now been kicked out of the room by John, to really decide that this matters and to do it? I just want to give you the space to kind of I bring this home for us.
Well, it always comes back to money and profit, and time is money. So it can't be all hug ops and kumbaya. Like, we're here to make money. I mean, and smoking opium is, you just hope that everybody just makes something beautiful and has low cost, and you make gobs of money for your shareholders and the ecosystem, and you employ a lot of people. But the reality is that there's a finite amount of money available. We have to stay competitive, we have to stay profitable, and we have to work in those parameters, or we're not going to exist anymore. So it's a matter of survival, it's a matter of existence. And so there's always that balance and trade-off and tension, and everybody's on the same team. So it's not management against devs and engineers and everyone else. It's not us against them. It's that we're all working together to achieve a common goal, and that's profit. So that is why corporations exist. That is why we have shareholders and we have customers. So we have to balance that. Time is money. We have to give people the space and the capabilities, and hire the capabilities and train the capabilities. But there has to be some realism to that. If somebody's making the same mistake over and over and over, that's expensive. They need to be fired. I get making mistakes. I get learning from mistakes, but you can't have people that are incompetent, right? You can't afford incompetence. Nobody can. So it's creating a culture of inclusion and forgiveness and postmortems, but also doing that with the right balance of cost and the right balance of profit. So that the clock is ticking. And so those mistakes, yeah, they're going to be made for sure, but you want to minimize them, and you want to minimize that impact, and you want to do that quickly and through the process, and not forget why we exist. And I think that's really critically important to understand why these silos have happened in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's super important. I want to even take some of what you said and even just frame it to what you said before, because some of it is not just even, it's not just that it's okay to mistakes. Some of what you're saying is like, it's almost unacceptable even for these leaders to not empower their teams, to not train them on security, to just put them in a work situation where they're hoping they're just going to figure it out, rather than doing, as a founder of a small company myself, kind of like, what is your responsibility towards making sure that the people who work for you are driving to what's necessary? When it comes to the profit motive, I want to just see like how you feel about, because you're talking about like a practicalism and a pragmaticism around, like, these businesses need to make money to survive. But in terms of what you're speaking to in broader risks, I'm wondering if it's just understanding that balance sheet just isn't about dollars in and dollars out, or fundamentally short-term returns. Because if you're not building these structures to prevent major risks at your organization, you will lose customers. Your organization itself might be vulnerable to hacks, and that itself has not been part of the financial equation, and it's only been about dollars in related to kind of products and services. Am I getting that right? I guess I'm trying to circle the square, because you've been very, I guess, like, very forceful with some of kind of the, you're almost coming at it with a very sharp knife, articulating some of these breaking points where companies are failing. And I'm just trying to see if I'm getting where you're coming from correctly, and then give it a bit of connective tissue. Am I on the right track here?
You are, and I'll refine that a bit. So the line on the balance sheet is often seen as a cost, and so an investment. I think security is an investment. I don't see it as a cost line item. So there has to be a shift in the mindset of how security is expenditures are being incurred. So there has to be a budget, and it needs to be framed in the right context. So you'll have old school management that, maybe from a CFO or accounting background, it's like, drive that down as far as possible and like nickel and dime it, without seeing that there's long-term ramifications for making a bad a bad decision in the short term. So we need long-term thinking. We need to understand risk mitigation and what the cost of breach really is, and then budget accordingly. So I see short-term thinking in some, improper risk mitigation because they have not done the proper managerial framework around that decision making, and they haven't allocated sufficient budget because they haven't shifted that mindset. So that mindset needs to occur at the board level and at the C-suite level, and then filter all the way through the organization.
Yeah. Okay. Top to bottom. Yeah. You can't really be pragmatic. You can't really be making the right decisions and responsible in the way you need if you're not seeing the whole picture. And I hope the conversation that we've had today is one where we've maybe opened up some people's eyes. Maybe there's a coming together. If we were in a non-COVID remote environment, we would be seeing devs, security, putting down their laptops, coming together and embracing, but then also having a clear-eyed look at kind of the work that they need to do so that, again, that work is good and that they're working together as teams. I have to be honest, you guys kind of blew my mind a bit. I really appreciate you coming on today and breaking this down for us, because I know it's a problem at organizations. I know it's something that people watching this right now are dealing with in their own organizations. They're looking for solutions. So I really appreciate all of you just coming on and laying it out in a really straightforward and honest way.
Thanks.
That was great. Appreciate you having us.
Thank you. Yeah. Great to be here
for
today.
those
Absolutely.
Totally. For those people who were watching this and just had their kind of minds blown or been furiously taking notes to go into their next sprint meeting and being like, hey, John and Dave said I didn't need to do this anymore. And Kara said that this is your responsibility, senior leadership. So we need to straighten this out. It's okay. You can, after your mind is blown, after you've picked it up off the floor and thought of the question, the follow-up question you wanted to answer, you can still submit that now. Go to Facebook, drop it in the comments in the live after on the VOD. We are going to have a full write-up on this conversation on BetaKit with an HD version of the session. And yeah, I'm just really looking forward to seeing maybe where this goes next. What cybersecurity conversation we have as part 4, because like now there's really no excuse. We've really laid it out for you how you should be approaching this inside your company. That said, I look forward to the next one. I will see you soon. Douglas Altus, BetaKit out.